Okay, so welcome to reading group 4 for George Gurdjieff's Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, all and everything. Um, so we finally finished chapter 1, which just isn't. It's a strange little chapter, which isn't to do with. Well, it is to do with the book, obviously, but the actual tales, the actual Beelzebub's Tales part we're now getting into, which is, as you'll all see, sort of a strange, sacred, fictional story which explains, allegorically and mythically explains, all the buffers and psychological hurdles that man needs to overcome to even begin his um, sort of ascent to become potentially become someone of a higher being. And then Meetings with Remarkable Men is the second series, and then there's a third series, and they both do separate things. So I'll sort of open the floor. Like, if anyone does want to do the reading this week, is anyone interested to do the reading?
I'll give it a shot.
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Okay,
I haven't practiced. Maybe I should have
that's
said
fine. I
that.
mean, the only thing I would say with this, so page 51 to 65, obviously that we're now starting the actual story. This is where Gurdjieff brings in a ton of neologisms and words that he's created and invented. And I've listened. There is actually, like, on YouTube, like an hour long thing of people who sort of knew Gurdjieff pronouncing them. And I've sort of gone for a few just to see basically what they're like. And really, they're just to help you along. But any word you see really is pretty much just pronounced as sort of syllabically, just like basically as it is. I mean, there's not too much. So I guess I'd just say before that the reason Gurdjieff put these words in is, one, he understood that the language that we habitually use can only take us so far. So creating new words allows us to actually begin from new meanings which we all collectively understand. And as you'll see, the words are complicatedly and spelt and formed. And this is also something which he put in to continually uh, keep our attention on the text. Um, so, sort of with that said, I think, don't sweat too much when you get to these. But yeah, if Nanya, if you're good to read, then I'll hand it over to you for pages 51 to 65. So 51 to 55 is why in solar system, and then 56 to 65 is cause of delay in falling. So yeah, I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Hopefully I don't butcher it too bad. Chapter 2, Introduction, Why Beelzebub Was in Our Solar System. It was in the year 223 after the creation of the world by objective time calculation, or, as it would be said here on the Earth, in the year 1921 after the birth of Christ. Through the universe flew the ship Karnak of the Trans-Space Communication. It was flying from the spaces Asuparatstata, that is, from the spaces of the Milky Way, from the planet Caritas to the solar system Pendetsknok, the sun of which is also called the pole star. On the said trans-space ship was Beelzebub with his kinsmen and near attendants. He was on his way to the planet Revozrerander to a special conference in which he had consented to take part, at the request of his friends of long standing. Only the remembrance of these old friendships had constrained him to accept this invitation, since he was no longer young, and so a lengthy a journey and the vicissitudes inseparable from it were by no means an easy task for one of his years. Only a little before this journey, Beelzebub had returned home to the planet Caritas, where he had received his arising, and far from which, on account of circumstances independent of his own essence, he had passed many years of his existence in conditions not proper to his nature. This many-yeared existence, unsuited to him, together with the perceptions unusual for his nature, and the experiences not proper to his essence involved in it, had not failed to leave on his common presence a perceptible mark. Besides, time itself had now inevitably aged him, and the said unusual conditions of existence had brought Beelzebub, just that Beelzebub, who had had such an exceptionally strong, fiery, and splendid youth, to an also exceptional old age. Long, long before, while Beelzebub was still existing, at home on the planet Caritas, he had been taken, owing to his extraordinary resourceful intelligence, into service on the Sun Absolute, where our Lord Sovereign Endlessness has the fundamental place of his dwelling, and there Beelzebub, among others like himself, had become an attendant upon his endlessness. It was just then that, owing to the as yet unformed reason due to his youth, and owing to his callow and therefore still impetuous mentation with unequally flowing association, that is, owing to mentation taste as it is natural to beings who have not yet become definitely responsible on a limited understanding, Beelzebub once saw in the government of the world something which seemed to him illogical, and having found support among his comrades, beings like himself not yet formed, interfered in what was none of his business. Thanks to the impetuosity and force of Beelzebub's nature, his intervention, together with his comrades, then soon captured all minds, and the effect was to bring the central kingdom of the megalocosmos almost to the edge of revolution. Having learned of this, his endlessness, notwithstanding his all-lovingness and all-forgiveness, was constrained to banish Beelzebub with his comrades to one of the remote corners of the universe, namely, to the solar system, Ors, whose inhabitants called it simply the solar system, and to assign as the place of their existence one of the planets of that solar system, namely Mars, with the privilege of existing on other planets also, though only of the same solar system. Among these exiles, besides the said comrades of Beelzebub, were a number of those who merely sympathized with them, and also the attendants and subordinates both of Beelzebub and of his comrades. All, with their households, arrived at this remote place, and there, in a short time on the planet Mars, a whole colony was formed of three centered beings from various planets of the central part of our great universe. All of this population, extraordinary for the said planet, accommodated itself little by little to its new dwelling place, and many of them even found one or another occupation for shortening the long years of their exile. They found occupations either on the same planet Mars or upon the neighboring planet, namely, on those planets that had been almost entirely neglected on account of their remoteness from the center and the poverty of all their formations. As the years rolled by, many, either on their own initiative or in response to needs of general character, migrated gradually from the planet Mars to other planets. But Beelzebub himself, together with his near attendants, remained on the planet Mars, where he organized his existence more or less tolerably. One of his chief occupations was the arranging of an observatory on the planet Mars for the observation both of remote points of the universe and of the conditions of existence of beings on neighboring planets. And this observatory of his, it may here be remarked afterwards, became well known and even famous everywhere in the universe. Although the solar system Ors had been neglected owing to its remoteness from the center and to many other reasons, nevertheless, our Lord Sovereign had sent from time to time his messengers to the planets of this system to regulate more or less the being existence of the three-brained beings arising on them, for the coordination of the process of their existence with the general world harmony. Unless to a certain planet of the solar system, namely the planet Earth, there was once sent, such as a messenger from our endlessness, a certain Ashita Shaimash, and as Beelzebub had then fulfilled a certain need in connection with his mission, the said messenger, when he returned once more to the Sun Absolute, earnestly besought his endlessness to pardon his once young and fiery but now aged Beelzebub. In view of this request of Ashieta Shamash, and also of the modest and cognoscent existence of Beelzebub himself, our Maker Creator pardoned him and gave him permission to return to the place of his arising. And that is why Beelzebub, after a long absence, happened now to be again in the center of the universe. His influence and authority had not only not declined during his exile, but, on the contrary, they had greatly increased, since all those around him were clearly aware that thanks to his prolonged existence in the aforementioned unusual conditions, his knowledge and experience must inevitably have been broadened and deepened. And so, when events of great importance occurred on one of the planets of the solar system, Peng did Notchkok, Beelzebub's old friends, had decided to intrude upon him and to invite him to the conference concerning these events. And it was as the outcome of this that Beelzebub was now making the long journey on the ship Karnak from the planet Caritas to the planet Reva, Revosvrondender. On this big spaceship Karnak, the passengers included the kinsmen and attendants of Beelzebub and also many beings who served on the ship itself. During the period to which this tale of ours refers, all the passengers were occupied either with their duties or simply with the actualization of what is called active being mentation. Among all of the passengers aboard the ship, one very handsome boy was conspicuous. He was always near Beelzebub himself. This was Hussein, the son of Beelzebub's favorite son, Tuluf. After his return from exile, Beelzebub had seen his grandson of his, Hussein, for the first time, and appreciating his good heart, and also, owing to what is called family attraction, he took an instant liking to him. And as the time happened to coincide with the time when the reason of little Hussein needed to be developed, Beelzebub, having a great deal of free time there, himself undertook the education of his grandson, and from that time on took Hussein everywhere about him with him. That is why Hassin was also accompanying Beelzebub on this long journey and was among the number around him. And Hassin, on his side, so loved his grandfather that he would not stir a step without him, and he eagerly absorbed everything his grandfather either said or taught. At the time of this narrative, Beelzebub with Hassin and his devoted old servant Ahun, who always accompanied them everywhere, were seated on the highest Kasnik, that is, on the upper deck of the ship Karnak, under the Kalno-Chrononis, somewhat resembling what we should call a large glass bell, and were talking there among themselves while observing the boundless space. Beelzebub was talking about the solar system where he had passed long years, and Beelzebub was just then describing the peculiarities of the nature of the planet Venus. During the conversation, it was reported to Beelzebub that the captain of their ship wished to speak with him and to request Beelzebub seated. Chapter 3. The cause of the delay in the falling of the ship Karnak. The captain soon afterward entered, and having performed before Beelzebub all the ceremonies appropriate to Beelzebub's rank, said, "Your right reverence, allow me to ask your authoritative opinion upon an inevitability that lies in the line of our course, and which will hinder our smooth falling by the shortest route. The point is that if we follow our intended course, then our ship, after 2 Kelprinos, will pass through the solar system, Voynich. But just through where our ship must pass, there must also pass about a Kelprino before the great comet belonging to that solar system and named Sakur, or as it is sometimes called, the Madcap. So if we keep to our proposed course, we must inevitably traverse the space through which this comet will have to pass. Your right reverence, of course, knows that this madcap comet always leaves in its tracks a great deal of Zilno-Trago, which, on entering the planetary body of a being, disorganizes most of its functions until all the Zilno-Trago is volatilized out of it. I thought at first, continued the captain, of avoiding the Zilno-Trago by steering the ship around these spheres, but for this long detour would be necessary, which would greatly lengthen the time of our passage. On the other hand, to wait somewhere until the Zilno-Trago is dispersed would take still longer. In view of the sharp distinction in the alternatives before us, I cannot myself decide what to do, and so I have ventured to trouble you, your right reverence, for your competent advice." The captain having finished speaking, Beelzebub thought a little and then said as follows: "Really, I do not know how to advise you, my dear captain. Ah, yes, in that solar system where I existed for a long time, there is a planet called Earth. On that planet arose, and still continue to arise, very strange three-centered beings. And among the beings of a continent of that planet called Asia, there arose and existed a very wise three-brained being who they called their Mullah Nasser Eddin. For each and every peculiar situation, great and small, in the existence of the beings there, Beelzebub continued, this same terrestrial sage, Mullah Nasir Eddin, had an apt and pithy saying, as all his sayings were full of the sense of truth for existence there. I also always use them there as a guide, in order to have a comfortable existence among the beings of that planet. And, in the given case too, my dear captain, I intend to profit by one of his wise sayings. In such a situation as befallen us, he would probably say, you cannot jump over your knees, and it is absurd to try to kiss your own elbow. I know I now say the same to you, and I add, there is nothing to be done. When an event is impending which arises from forces immeasurably greater than our own, one must submit. The only question is, which of the alternatives you mentioned should be chosen? That is, to wait somewhere, or to add to our journey by a detour. You say that to make a detour will greatly lengthen our journey, but that waiting will take still longer. Good, my dear captain. Suppose that by making the detour we should save a little time. What do you think? Is the wear and tear of the parts of your ship's machinery worth while for the sake of ending our journey a little sooner? If the detour should involve even the most trifling damage to our ship, then in my opinion we ought to prefer your second suggestion. That is, to stop somewhere until the path is cleared of the noxious Zilno Trago. By that means, we should spare our ship useless damage, and we will try to fill the period of this unforeseen delay with something useful for us all. For instance, it would give me personally great pleasure to talk with you about contemporary ships in general and about our ship in particular. Very many new things, of which I still know nothing, have been done in this field during my absence from these parts. For example, in my time, these big trans-space ships were so complicated and cumbersome that it took almost half their power to carry the materials necessary to elaborate their possibility of locomotion. But in their simplicity and the freedom on these contemporary ships are just embodiments of bliss-do-curno. There is such a simplicity for beings upon them, and such freedom in respect of all being manifestations, that at times you forget that you are not on one of the planets. So, my dear captain, I should like very much to know how this boon was brought about, and how the contemporary ships work. But now go and make all arrangements necessary for the required stopping, and then, when you are quite free, come to me again, and we shall pass the time of our unavoidable delay in conversation useful for us all. When the captain had gone, Hussein suddenly sprang to his feet and began to dance and clap his hands and shout, oh, I'm glad of this. Beelzebub looked with affection on the joyous manifestations of his favorite, but old Ahun could not restrain himself, and shaking his head reproachfully, called the boy, half to himself, a growing egoist. Hearing what Ahun called him, Hussein stopped in front of him and looked at him mischievously and said, don't be angry with me, old Ahun. The reason of my joy is not egoism, but only the coincidence which chances to be happy for me. You heard, didn't you? My dear grandfather did not decide only just to make a stop, but he also promised the captain to talk with him. And you know, don't you, that the talks of my dear grandfather always bring out tales of places where he has been, and you know also how delightfully he tells them, and how much new and interesting information becomes crystallized in our presences from these tales. Where is the egoism? Hasn't he himself, of his own free will, having weighed with his wise reason all the circumstances of this unforeseen event, decided to make a stop which evidently doesn't upset his intended plans very much? It seems to me that my dear grandfather has no need to hurry. Everything necessary for his rest and comfort is present on the Karnak, and here also are many who love him and whom he loves. Don't you remember, he said recently, we must not oppose forces higher than our own, and added that not only one must not oppose them, but even submit and receive all the results with reverence, at the same time praising and glorifying the wonderful and providential works of our Lord Creator? I am not glad because of the misadventure, but because of an unforeseen event issuing from above has occurred, owing to which we shall be able to listen once more to the tales of my dear grandfather. Is it my fault that the circumstances are by chance most desirable and happy for me? No, dear Ahun. Not only should you not rebuke me, but you should join me in expressing gratitude to the source of all beneficent results that arise. All this time Beelzebub listened attentively, and with a smile, to the chatter of his favorite, and when he had finished said, you are right, dear Hussein. And for being right, I will tell you, even before the captain's arrival, anything you like. Upon hearing this, the boy at once ran and sat at the feet of Beelzebub, and after thinking a little said, My dear grandfather, you have told me so much about the solar system where you spent so many years that now perhaps I could continue just by logic alone to describe the details of the nature of the peculiar corner of our universe. But I am curious to know whether there dwell three-brained beings on the planet of that solar system and whether higher being bodies are coded in them. Please tell me now just this, dear grandfather, concluded Hussein, looking affectionately up at Beelzebub. Yes, replied Beelzebub. On almost all the planets of that solar system also, three-brained beings dwell, and in almost all of them higher being bodies can be coded. Higher being bodies, or as they are called on some planets of that solar system, souls, arise in the three brain beings breeding on all the planets except those before reaching which the emanations of our most holy Sun Absolute, owing to repeated deflections, gradually lose the fullness of their strength and eventually cease entirely to contain the vivific power of for coding higher being bodies. Certainly, my boy. On each separate planet of that solar system, also, the planetary bodies of the three brain beings are coded and take an exterior form in conformity with the nature of the given planet and are adapted in their details to the surrounding nature. For instance, on that planet on which it was ordained that all we exiles should exist, namely, the planet Mars, the three brain beings are coated with planetary bodies having the form, how shall I tell you? A form like a karuna. That is to say, they have a long, broad trunk, amply provided with fat, and heads with enormous protruding and shining eyes. On the back of this enormous planetary body of theirs are two large wings, and on the underside, two comparatively small feet with very strong claws. Almost the whole strength of this enormous planetary body is adapted by nature to generate energy for their eyes and for their wings. As a result, the three brain beings breeding on that planet can see freely everywhere, whatever the Kaldazakti, and they can also move not only over the planet itself, but also in its atmosphere, and some of them occasionally even manage to travel beyond the limits of its atmosphere. The three brain beings breeding on another planet, a little below the planet Mars, owing to the intense cold there, are covered with thick, soft wool. The external form of these three centered beings is like that of a tusuk. That is, it resembles a kind of double sphere, the upper sphere serving to contain the principal organs of the whole planetary body, and the other, the lower sphere, the organs for the transformation of the first and second being foods. There are three apertures in the upper sphere opening outwards. Two serve for sight and the third for hearing. The other, the lower sphere, has only two apertures, one in front for taking in the first and second being foods, and the other at the back of the elimination from the organism of residues. To the lower sphere are also attached two very strong sinewy feet, and on each of these is a growth that serves the purpose of fingers with us. There is still another planet, a quite small one, bearing the name Moon in that solar system, my dear boy. During its motion, this peculiar little planet often approached very near to our planet Mars, and sometimes during whole Kilprinos, I took great pleasure in observing through my Tescuano in my observatory the process of existence of the three brain beings upon it. Though the beings of this planet have very frail planetary bodies, they have, on the other hand, a very strong spirit, owing to which they all possess an extraordinary perseverance and capacity for work. In exterior form, they resemble what are called large ants, and like these, they are always bustling about, working both on and within their planet. The results of their ceaseless activity are now already plainly visible. I once happened to notice that during 2 of our years they tunneled, so to say, the whole of their planet. They were compelled to undertake this task on account of the abnormal local climatic conditions, which are due to the fact that this planet arose unexpectedly, and the regulation of its climatic harmony was therefore not prearranged by the higher powers. The climate of this planet is mad, and in its variability it could give points to the most highly strung hysterical woman existing on another of the planets of that same solar system, of which I shall also tell you. Sometimes there are such frosts on this moon that everything is frozen through and through, and it becomes impossible for beings to breathe in the open atmosphere. Then suddenly it becomes so hot there is an egg that can be cooked in its atmosphere in a jiffy. For only 2 short periods on that peculiar little planet, namely, before and after its complete revolution about its neighbor, another planet nearby, the weather is so glorious that for 7 rotations the whole planet is in blossom, and yields the various products for their first being food greatly in excess of their general need during their existence in that peculiar interplanetary kingdom, which they have arranged, and where they are protected from all the vagaries of this mad climate inharmoniously changing the state of the atmosphere. Nearest to that small planet is another, a larger planet, which also occasionally approaches quite close to the planet Mars and is called Earth. The said moon is just part of this Earth, and the latter must now constantly maintain the moon's existence. On the just mentioned planet Earth, also, 3 brain beings are formed, and they also contain all the data for coded higher being bodies in themselves. But in strength of spirit, they do not begin to compare with the beings breeding on the little planet aforementioned. The external coatings of the 3 brain beings of that planet, Earth, closely resemble our own. Only, first of all, their skin is a little slimier than ours, and then, secondly, they have no tail, and their heads are without horns. What is worst about them is their feet, namely, they have no hooves. It is true that for protection against external influence, they have invented what they call boots, but this invention does not help them very much. Apart from the imperfection of their exterior form, their reason also is quite uniquely strange. Their being reason, owing to very many causes about which also I may tell you sometime, has gradually degenerated, and at the present time is very, very strange and exceedingly peculiar. Beelzebub would have said still more, but the captain of the ship entering at that moment, Beelzebub, after promising the boy to tell him about the beings of the planet Earth on another occasion, began to talk with the captain. Beelzebub asked the captain to tell him, first, who he was, how long he had been captain, and how he liked his work, and afterwards to explain some of the details of the contemporary cosmic ships. Thereupon the captain said, "Your right reverence, I was destined by my father, as soon as I reached the age of a responsible being, for this career in the service of our endless Creator. Starting with the lowest positions on the trans-space ships, I ultimately merited to perform the duties of captain, and it is now 8 years that I have been captain on the long-distance ships. This last post of mine, namely that of captain of the ship Karnak, I took, strictly speaking, in succession to my father, when, after his long years of blameless service to his endlessness, in the performance of the duties of captain from almost the very beginning of the world creation, he had become worthy to be promoted to the post of ruler of the solar system Kalman. In short, continued the captain, I began my service just when your right reverence was departing for the place of your exile. I was still only a sweeper on the long distance ships of that period. Yes, a long, long time has passed. Everything has undergone change and has changed since then. Only our Lord and Sovereign remains unchanged. The blessings of Amenzano on his unchangeableness throughout eternity. You, your right reverence, have condescended to remark very justly that the former ships were very inconvenient and cumbersome. Yes, they were then, indeed, very complicated and cumbersome. I too remember them very well. There is an enormous difference between the ships of that time and the ships now. In our youth, all ships, both for intersystem and for interplanetary communication, were still run on the cosmic substance Ella Kilpomagtizin, which is a totally consisting of 2 separate parts of omnipresent Okadadnak, and it was to obtain this totality that just those numerous materials were necessary which the former ships had to carry. But these ships did not remain in use long after you flew from these parts, having soon thereafter been replaced by ships of the system of St. Vinoma.
Well read. How was
That
that?
was, that was hard.
It's
It's
strange.
harder than I thought.
It's strange, right?
Yeah, for sure. And it definitely, I don't know, I found it easier to, I guess, read it aloud than I've been following along to other people reading. It,
Yeah, yeah. I'd sort of, I guess, urge everyone. Maybe none of you'd now agree, and maybe Holly as well. Like, even though I've only read twice, like reading it yourself out loud, like reading it just normally, reading it out loud, and listening to it are all 3 completely separate things. And reading it yourself is sort of an odd experience. It just seems to sink in, in a different way. Um, But thanks, Nanya. That was very well read, especially especially with regard to all the new neologisms. So just to sort of give your voice a break, there's obviously quite a few things going on here, and I guess one thing I'm realizing is, even though that it is separated into all these chapters, I just looked like the next chapter is the law of falling, but we're obviously dealing with this idea of falling already in this chapter which we've just read, and the cause of delay in falling of Karnak. So Karnak, it seems, is a reference to. I mean, obviously, this is for Gurdjieff, as we're realizing, there is no words are really put in willy nilly. So that wherever there is something like this, there's going to be a reason. And I did have to look into this, and it seems it's the name of a temple in Egypt, and it was an initiatory temple, which was attempting to sort of marry science, art, and religion. So it seems that, it's one of those cases where some people seem to take Gurdjieff completely. Sometimes people take him completely to his word, in the sense that this is some like literal idea of something, which I think is not really the best way to go about it. I mean, there's mentions in his other work about he believes that Jesus was part of the Sarmung Brotherhood, which is like this sort of mythical brotherhood of ancient wisdom teachers, and people take this literally, and many people have gone and tried to search for, the reality of this brotherhood. The same thing happened with Madame Blavatsky with her Mahamatas, these ancient wisdom teachers, trying to source them out. And I think really in that sense, they're just ideas for the fact that such a thing can exist. And I think the same thing with Karnak is like, perhaps the best thing is to not take this literally as like, why is it a spaceship? Perhaps we could look into that and why Gurdjieff chose space in general. And I mean, obviously the planets play a big part as well. But Karnak, on that level, seems to be the place in which there is a transformation happening for those who are in almost like attendance. It's probably becoming clear so I'm just going through like the things we can chat about here. It's probably becoming clear to you, and much clearer in this part, obviously, because we're now starting with actually meeting Beelzebub and meeting Hussein, his grandson, which is, that's the dialogue that's going on. But it's fairly clear that Gurdjieff is basically Beelzebub in this. Now, what's interesting really is we're in the position of great-grandsons or great-granddaughters. So if you reread the title in that sense, it's Gurdjieff's tales to his grandson. And it's generally accepted, I believe, where I've read in various places, that obviously, so if we take it in that sense of Gurdjieff's children, you have his first generation of students, people like Maurice Nicol, forgot her name, Jean de Salzman, Uspensky, and they're his kids. And then obviously something needs to come from the source itself for the grandchildren, because the grandfather's not going to be around. So we're now the sort of the great grandfather, even though there is actually about 3 true children of Gurdjieff still alive. We are the generation, I guess, to a degree, that is meant to be reading this work. And obviously you could stretch that out and say, well, this is for any generation, on and on and on. Now, as to why, I think this is going to be probably the section where the question comes up, why Beelzebub? Now, for me, at least, something I spotted that seems perhaps a bit too obvious for Gurdjieff is the fact we're dealing with this idea of falling. Now, he has specific ideas of what falling is in the next section, but of course, in relation to the fall, in relation to Christ, the fall away from Eden, in terms of original sin, that idea that there's something innate in us which draws us away from the heavenly eternity of Eden, and we have to do something to get back there. It seems that Beelzebub, the devil, in other words, is completely fallen. That's the one person who's completely fallen. So it almost seems paradoxical to take advice from that person, but then I guess in an almost tongue-in-cheek way, it's the one person who could teach you how not to get into that state. So we could look into that idea of the fall, what Gurdjieff's talking about here in relation to the fall from Eden, and whether or not Karnak is sort of I'm thinking of C.S. Lewis's novel The Great Divorce, which is like a bus ride from hell to heaven, and whether or not Gurdjieff is really talking about a sort of metaphorical journey where we're beginning at that position of original sin, of being fallen, and then we are developing in a new way how to overcome these things, and then there's been the first mention of active being mentation, which, from what I can recall, is in other words, is self-remembering, which we can look into. And also, I'm sort of interested in the way that he described the other alien beings, and instead of sort of assessing them as a whole, he sort of goes through all their orifices and how things are processed, and each limb and what it does, etc. And it's like that objective look at the body, not as this thing which is in equilibrium, which is a whole, but actually he's looking at the parts and he's like, yeah, these two openings do this opening does that, they don't have, like, they need boots. And it seems he's looking at looking at beings, even though that wasn't the human, it's very close to a human in description. He's looking at beings in such a way as like it's not immediately a whole, and that any equilibrium that is to be found in Gurdjieff's work is to be found through a sort of a lengthy work process. So they're sort of the notes that I've got taken down. If there's anything else that jumps out for people, then be sure to say. But yeah, if there's anything someone wants to bring in, then please do.
So, do you have any theories about why he chose the science fiction genre?
I mean, it's a strange one. Even I mean, guess when he's writing this. So that first, I should probably know these dates a bit better, but I know the first very, very rough edition, which Alfred Orage had, and I believe was initially in Russian, was from 1931. So, I mean, anyone who might maybe know their sci-fi history, when was H.G. Wells was... I can't remember. I don't know. I'm going to quickly look it up just to sort of put this in relation to the history of science fiction. H.G. Wells was... War of the Worlds was like 1898. So, okay, so I guess science fiction at this point is somewhat in the... out in the world. I mean, as to why he chose it, I guess perhaps he could just do more with it. But it does seem like a strange choice. But equally, even though I've described it as a science fiction story, it sort of comes across as a sacred text most of the time. It's like but I don't know any like the general biography as to why. I mean, I know that he just read it out loud, which seems like an absolute feat in itself. So he never took any notes of this. All of a sudden one day he said he wanted to write, and he just started reciting it to various people who noted it down. And I think it was somewhat sort of complete as it came out, and it obviously needed changes and translation. But that in itself, reading it now, is like, how the hell did you like maintain this story in your mind? So there must be some coherent whole there that he knew all along, and was trying to piece together. I'm wondering if anyone else actually agrees with my idea of it being anything related to the fall.
I mean, I don't disagree. I guess there is also the ascending, descending. Isn't that right, with the rays of creation?
Yeah. So the ray of creation is like the absolute through to the sun, through to the solar system, through to the Milky Way, then through, I guess, to Earth, and then the moon, and then man, and then each time there's laws, and then they get added. So the laws that you're bound to on each level increase. So you're bound to more and more laws, which I guess in a way you are to overcome those laws, and then you can, sort of ascend in that sense. But you can also draw from those higher levels as well. So you can draw sort of, I guess, intuition from those higher levels. I'll try to find a picture of the ray of creation because it'll make it a lot easier to understand what I'm on about. But yeah, there is a very clear hierarchical sense in Gurdjieff, and I don't, he never shies away from that.
I want to know your thoughts on the reason why Mars is so like preeminent in this. Like his observatory is there, and I mean, for a big part of the book, he sees the other planets and all from Mars. I mean, is there any significance between Mars and something? I don't know.
That's a big question because it's something that jumped out of me. Like now listening to it, it's obvious that there must be some significance to it. And I don't know if anyone in here, I mean, I don't know astrology that well. I don't know the significance. I know is Mars the it's the god of war?
Yeah. He talks about like war being like some of the most negative aspects of like three brain beings. Like it's the antithesis of just being like going to eat and all that. Like war is the worst thing that happened to human brains, and Mars being a planet of war. But I don't know. The only thing I thought about is just maybe some relation to some kind of struggle that Beelzebub was going through. I don't know. Maybe.
Potentially. I mean, I'll just jump a few comments on what you said about war being. So for anyone who hasn't read later on, for Gurdjieff, war is when in this section it does come up, but he doesn't explicitly state really what he's on about. When he's on about near the end there, when he's saying, "Oh, the three brain beings of this planet have a very, very peculiar and strange reason." Reason capital R as in the critique of pure reason or human reason. What he means by that is that we need war. We always have war, and that there's certain points in it that, I'm not massively, I guess I don't identify as a pacifist, but the way Gurdjieff writes about war makes you realise, I mean, you could say it out loud and we've become so accepting of war, like, oh yeah, there's wars and it's not a surprise to us, but the way Gurdjieff writes about war, he's like, no, the people on this planet kill each other all the time, and the way he writes about it in such a simple manner makes it so obvious as to what it is and how it's like just the most ridiculous thing, makes you realise that he's obviously onto something in terms of what has gone wrong in our reasoning to allow for sort of the mass war of ourselves. And then he does he changes that into like the idea that the reason this happens is because we are asleep, and that the sleep is needed to feed the moon. Now, feeding the moon is a huge idea which I just completely really want to grasp, and I think it's really, really important, but I just can't like find the thing I need to be able to understand why, like, what that is. And I mean, back to that idea of what someone said about the ray of creation and the ascending descending thing, and also the Mars thing, is that I know at a certain point Gurdjieff basically says that once the moon is fully fed, it will become an Earth of its own, and in that time span, the Earth will become its own thing. So whether or not, when we look at Mars, that is the sort of ascended planet, what Earth will become. So in looking at Mars, we're sort of looking at that tutor, that thing that's gone one level higher, our next master up. But I mean, I don't think he was. I'm sure he's well aware of the zodiac and astrological ideas. So whether or not there's something more in the idea of Mars, that certainly seems important.
Mars isn't just war either. I think it's action and work. Obviously, Gurdjieff is a big fan of work.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, just one more thing. I think, the definition of war, like Gurdjieff, it's much more than just armed conflict and all that. It's like almost a state of conscience of making war to everyone, like in every single way, right? But yeah, I don't know. I think there's a lot of things here too. I mean, after that, as he points out, as war is just as some kind of evil thing. I mean, I think it's pretty important in the whole context of the book too.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, maybe my description of it. I mean, that was a very rough description, but as you've said, Whether or not, I don't know. I mean, you brought in the word evil there, and I don't know how you would. I couldn't really tell how you're trying to get that across, but it's like whether or not it's like evil would come into that form of reason and that be utilized. Like I guess that's why he says it's very, very peculiar and strange, because it just, in the sense that it's evil, how can you sort of say it's evil? And it's, as you say, it's that almost like a universal hostility, a constant competition with beings of your own kind, and why we're compelled to do that all the time. Yeah, I mean, I think Mars. Maybe Mars is probably the almost. Well, no, there wasn't too. I know we get to Mars more later on. But I mean, does anyone else have anything to say about Mars?
I mean, going back to the sci-fi thing,
Mm-hmm.
I looked it up really quickly, but Edgar Rice Burroughs had already published his John Carter of Mars. I don't know. I'm guessing Gurdjieff didn't read a lot of sci-fi, but
There's
I don't know.
There's not really many references of what he read. Like, obviously we know he read Edian, anything that's referenced in the books, but like even in his students' diaries and things, I haven't yet to come across mentions of them saying, "Oh, Gurdjieff, was like enjoying this book." I mean, it's clear he would have read the Bible and maybe read some sort of, maybe like something like the Enneads. I know, 1001 Nights. I know that he thoroughly enjoyed that work. But other than that, there's just not. It's hard to imagine him sort of sitting down with a sci-fi novel.
But did someone last week mention that he watched movies?
Yeah, no, he watched movies. Yeah, but there's no that he loved going to the cinema. But there's also no reference of. I'd love to know what films he really enjoyed. But I've yet to find any references.
Well, I know that there was a trip to the moon was a big one in the early France.
Yeah. I've seen that. That's like an early surrealist film, right?
Yeah. I just find it fascinating because like L. Ron Hubbard did the same thing with kind of Dianetics and other sci-fi stuff. That was obviously years later, but sci-fi seems to be an interesting vehicle.
Yeah, I mean, I guess with I don't know Dianetic stuff like but from what I understand, that leans far heavier on sci-fi tropes.
Right.
Yeah, I haven't really spent much time.
I don't mean to compare.
I don't know. I'm just reading through Mars in one of my astrology work books, and it just seems like I'll just read a little bit of it. The star of Mars signifies violence, wars, robbery, screams, insolence, adultery, taking away one's possessions, banishment, exile, estrangement from one's parents, which I thought was interesting.
I mean, that all sounds like the fall from Eden. I mean, I'm also on like a Gurdjieff site which is talking about ancient astrology, and it's saying Mars is the force of the will, which strives to realize the individual. It is self-will, which enables every created cosmos to live according to its own laws. It is the will to live and say yes to life, to fight for the best conditions. With only the will of the first central appearance of consciousness of every cosmos is to realize its content. It is the centrifugal force which enables everything to go straight on its own way. With only the centrifugal force, the Earth would leave its orbit and get lost in the immense space of the universe. So it seems like, I mean, self-will is a huge idea in Orthodox Christian teachings, which Gurdjieff was highly, heavily influenced by, especially Syriac and Armenian orthodoxy. And self-will is something that you're actually supposed to get rid of in those teachings. So whether or not that's the first thing, that it's less that you're influenced by it, but you're using Mars as like this example of what not to do. Because to go back to that important point of how Gurdjieff describes these the first series, this book, First series to destroy mercilessly without any compromises whatsoever in the mentation feelings of the reader, the beliefs and views by centuries rooted in him, by everything existing in the world. So there's almost like potentially this idea, because we're dealing with Beelzebub, we're dealing with Mars, we're dealing with the ultimate sinful and trapped and constrained creature, Beelzebub, who clearly understands his own limitation and constraints, and is developing this massive story about things. But he's also on this planet, which is the one of the self-will and the realizing of individuality. Perhaps the lessons we're meant to learn from him are the ones that, how not to do things in a way. So in destroying things mercilessly, Beelzebub, I don't want to seem too sinful saying this, but Beelzebub is almost he's almost trying to sympathize and say here's where I went wrong and I'm stuck now. But yeah, that's my very sort of loose ramble on that. I mean, has anyone else thought about why, the why of Beelzebub? Because it's still mystifying me as to why the figure.
I've read some works of a contemporary of Gurdjieff, who is also from the sort of Syriac Eastern Orthodox branch of Christianity, I guess. And they use Beelzebub. They see Beelzebub, or the devil, and his various incarnations, as the right-hand man of God, or right-hand creature of God, which helps people get on the path, essentially. So it might have something to do with that. I'm not too sure. The person I read is someone called Omram Mikhail Ivanhoff.
How do you spell it?
It's I'll
got
put
it.
a link in the chat later. Yeah, you got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the idea of, I mean, this is just a guess, but the idea of Mars, Earth, and the moon could be the moon is kind of in an undifferentiated state with a potential. The Earth is going through a differentiation, and Mars is completed, now barren sort of process, right? So I don't know, it might have something to do with that, because I'm thinking, in this Syriac Christianity, or this particular Omram Mikhail Ivanhoff branch, they see it as, they look at the sort of creation myth as, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So it's alluding to, coming out of the Garden of Eden as gaining the ability to differentiate, and thus developing problems and conflict inside of ourselves, because we're starting to become torn between two opposite poles. And the idea in Omram's work, who they also work a lot with light, by the way, which is kind of interesting. I heard someone mention light, is to, and I think with Gurdjieff and a lot of other schools, I guess, as well, is to unify the being, right? Through will, we unify the mind. So I don't know. I'm just throwing things out there. I'm not certain about any of this. Just a mention.
That's interesting. I mean, it's interesting what you say about the Earth, the difference between the Earth and Mars in that empirical sense, that the Earth is obviously teeming with beings and with life, and the Mars is barren in that sense. There's no life there, which would come, would come to mean that there's a sense that it's been processed, it's gone somewhere else. That idea of life, and I mean, the idea of when you come from Eden, you are then. That's the point when you're given free will. I mean, that's the test from God. Not to keep dragging it back to the Christian angle, but I mean, this idea is evident in many teachings, that you're given that free will, you're given that choice. And I guess to sort of distinguish that in the Gurdjieffian sense is that the choice between good and evil for Gurdjieff, I guess, wouldn't be the true choice. His point would be that the position of the third, right? So you always have the positive and the negative force. The important one for Gurdjieff is the neutral, which might seem like you're just falling into one of the other choices, but the point of that is that you are attentive enough to assess and analyze with your emotions, your intellect, and your intuition, both the positive and negative, neutralize those forces, and then make the choice yourself. So as you were mentioning, it's about that, like, you are given this free will of differentiation between what is good, what is bad, what is, whatever. You're given that, and then you're allowed to, you're given the point to work through it. And of course, that's his idea of getting out of sleep. That's why getting out of sleep is important, because unless you're out of sleep and you're awake, those choices aren't actually your own. They are, just automatic, habitual choices. But
one thing.
I was just going to ask, where with Ivanov did you read about the Beelzebub thing?
I read quite a few of his books. Again, this was probably about, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. But I think one that I found particularly interesting. I think there's two actually, which I'm specifically referring to. One is called, I think, just literally the book of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one is the book of divine magic, and that also has a lot of practices of working with light.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of meditative, but they remind me a lot of like different types of qigong that I've come across as well. And it's interesting that you mentioned this idea of neutral as well, because unconnected to anything I said before, I've come across some interesting modern, like contemporary schools of Buddhism with meditative practice, which specifically emphasize that idea. So the neutral point, to be able to, observe the process as it's happening, to flow with the moment, so that you're always in the middle, not sort of like biased, again, not differentiated. It's quite it expands quite a lot into various philosophical concepts, but similar sort of idea, I think.
It's interesting. I'm definitely gonna look into him.
Yeah, I was just gonna point out kind of weird thing that I read. Beelzebub would say as Lord of the Flies, but the description of the planetary body of Martians kind of sounds like a fly. I don't know if it. I mean, he talks about a head with enormous protruding and shining eyes, 2 wings, small feet, strong claws. I don't know, maybe.
It sounds
I
like
don't know if that's too much of a reach.
Sounds like a what? Sounds like a what? Sorry.
Oh, a fly. The planetary body of the 3 brain beings from Mars, like the description of their planetary bodies, sound like a fly, because it talks about a head with enormous protruding and shining eyes, 2 large wings, and 2 comparatively small feet. And I don't know, maybe.
I remember when I first read it,
I mean,
I remember
it says
thinking
about-
it sounded like a crow.
Yeah. Well, I think it talks about crows and Saturn or Jupiter. I don't know. But yeah, maybe. And also, he was had some kind of position in Mars, like in the story. Of course, it's like some kind of political or something position in Mars, because maybe it's the Lord of the people from Mars. Maybe, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else people might have spotted, or they want to talk about or bring in? No one?
No, it's all perfectly clear.
I'm glad we worked it out. through the sections and see, like, I mean, there's always something to sort of potentially bring in his terms towards, so like endless creator, how he terms higher powers, and it's sort of always that question of, well, I see that you're referencing what we understand to be God, so it's like, why is he purposely not using the word God? His endlessness, and there's even at one point he uses like 3 terms in a row which seem to go towards those 3 characteristics of God, right, as being like all-knowing, all-loving, and omnipotent. So his endlessness, his all-lovingness, and his all-forgiveness, which is like, well, that's, you're talking of God, but I guess he is this a move away from systematic religion, because he understands that as soon as you say the word God, you're constraining it to what potentially some, if you're of a certain organized religion, you're going to be constrained.
Yeah, and it's interesting how the term changes throughout like the chapter. Like the one that's the all common master, the merciless hero pass, and it just, it's all different references for the, which is, I shouldn't say obviously is referencing the same kind of concept, but it's very interesting.
And also, like, so he does that, and with the language thing, I mean, sometimes with the words that he's bringing in, I would urge everyone to sort of look them up. There's new ones, so like Zilno-Trago and things like this. These are terms which are like specifically related to his ideas, and they mean certain things within his theory. But then it's like, there's the footnote. The word kilpreno in the language of Beelzebub means a certain period of time, equal approximately to the duration of the flow of time, which we call an hour. So it's like, in the one sense, this is clearly a little practice from Gurdjieff to say, like, right, you now need to remember while reading this 1200 page book, that the word kilpreno just means hour. So it's like, there's one, that's like just this tiny test. But then again, so I use the word Zilno-Trago there, is the name of a special gas similar to what we call cyanic acid. It's like, great, now I've got to go look this up, and it's just constant, in a good way. But there's obviously that question of constant little things where he's saying, like, this is named Secure, or it's sometimes called the Madcap, and there's tons just going on in that alone. I know there is a book by Paul, I haven't read it, Paul Beekman Taylor, who's a scholar of medieval languages, who and he's the guy who's like, he knew Gurdjieff, he's still alive, and he's written a book on Gurdjieff's use of language and words, so I might get a hold of that and see if there's any juicy stuff I can use in that. But yeah. But the beginning of the first bit we read, the beginning, why Beelzebub was in our solar system, that is where it made me think of the fall, because having learned of this, his endlessness, notwithstanding his all-lovingness and all-forgiveness, constrained to banish Beelzebub with his comrades to one of the remote corners of the universe, namely the solar system Oars, or the solar system, which seems, I mean, allegorically speaking, that just seems like literally reads as it's just a retelling of God banishing the devil to hell, which would imply that this solar system is hell. Now, from what I understand later on, Gurdjieff does talk about, he talks about purgatory a lot, but he also does talk about hell and heaven. And hell for Gurdjieff isn't the absolutist fire and brimstone hell of Catholics or certain denominations, but it doesn't also seem to be along those lines at all. Hell is a possible, so emphasis on that word possible, is a possible state here on earth for people to get into. And I mean, imagine it's a certain state of sleep, you can be drawn into hell on earth, in the same way you can be drawn into heaven, and that's a potential state for you to either avoid in the way that you attend to your internal reactions to the world outside of you. But it begs the question once again, which I think is intriguing, is why is it important that we understand we are learning from within hell? But I guess maybe that's Gurdjieff's point, is like that the worst place to start is the best place to start, right? You have to start with, you can't jump the gun. You've got to start with the worst of you.
I mean, isn't there a connection, obviously, to Mars and Prometheus in the mythology of the Titans and the gods and humans discovering light through Prometheus? And I would imagine there's some sort of escapism occurring from the Titan origin into like knowledge, which of course Christianity supposedly offers an escape from mythological sacrifice and order. So I wonder if there's a connection between Mars as a brimming of knowledge and light and an escapology from hell, perhaps, or maybe it's the opposite. I'm not sure.
It'd be interesting to, the idea of bringing light into hell is certainly an interesting idea.
Well, also, isn't the devil the light bringer as well, depending on how you look at it? So it's kind of conflicting for me thinking about it that way.
In what sense is the...
Well, I guess in terms of like science, bringing science to light or to known things, I guess sort of pushes your behavior against the will of God, giving up to God because you are increasingly looking for unbelief, I guess you could say.
I mean, that's yeah, okay, that's a really interesting point. I mean, perhaps if you allow me to stretch that out, that seems to me now, just thinking about it, back to that, the positive, the negative, and the neutralizing. So in a way, you have the positive of submitting to the will of God, which is giving up your self-will, and you let things be. And Gurdjieff often mentions nothing happens, everything, everyone just does things, right? And there's no will out there. Things just happen. And like he goes on about this later on, the law of accident, the idea of change, and it's like things just happen. Like, once you understand sleep, you realize that the whole idea of free will is really not as we sort of reason it to be. But then obviously, so in a certain way, that seems maybe that could be the positive side of things, and then the negative is getting drawn into the fruits of that tree, the fruits of knowledge, the fruits of inquiring with the devil, with the guy who's luring you in. Gurdjieff's important position, I guess, and I guess maybe this is why he's, some people have deemed him the rascal saint, is to bring in that third neutralizing force where you take both positions. And I guess in that sense, he would then make it clear that by completely understanding your self-will first, and I mean, at a certain point he said the only way anyone can become an altruist, someone who's giving, someone who's loving and respective, is first become a complete egoist, right? Because until you truly know yourself and your own desires and your own what it is you want from life, what it is you need from life, what it is you actually desire deep down, you can't be sincere in your altruistic actions. And perhaps that's what Gurdjieff is saying, in going between those two modes. Then once you truly understand yourself, then your move towards God is going to be truly sincere, because you've investigated all that has been given to you from a completely objective standpoint, as opposed to sort of just falling into a sleep. I mean, I guess it's a very controversial thing to say in a way, which Nietzsche goes on about and other thinkers, which is like, how can you, from a Gurdjieffian angle, how can you say that your belief in God or your belief in a certain religion is true if you were just brought up in that first form of mentation, which Gurdjieff goes on about, right? If all the habitual atmosphere that you were brought up in is always just told you to do this thing and it's right, in what sense can you say that's a sincere thing to do? And I guess in that sense, that's when you learn from the opposite, right? The negative force, the devil, to then neutralize between the two and find out what it is you truly want to go towards or ascend to.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, when the dreamer knows they're dreaming, you can control the dream, but then it dissipates quite quickly. It starts to fall in its own sense. And it's like, you can dance with the devil using a Gurdjieff sort of practice, as he does. Maybe you can sort of break down the dream that you now consciously know that you're dreaming in, and then some new consciousness awakes. I don't know, being poetic about it, I guess.
I can't remember is that from a song? I don't know how that full saying goes. You can dance with the devil, but there's a.
Oh, I don't know. I just pulled that from my ass, to be honest.
There's a. I mean, that could be a very help. It's like you can't dance with the devil quite. You can't dance with the devil. The devil doesn't change. The devil changes you. You can't dance with the devil. You don't get to pick the tune. Okay, so I guess the thing. I guess the problem is like, in that sort of Christian tradition, dancing with the devil, you always have already been completely drawn in, right? That's the problem with the devil and problem with like demonic and satanic forces is that you don't realize when they're drawing them in. So I guess that is where it comes back to that idea of attention. Is like, what's the difference between completely giving up your self-will and you don't even know it, and giving up your self-will and actually working out why in the process, right? Not just being like, right, I'm just going to give up my self-will, I'm just going to submit, but being attentive in that process while you do it. Just like the risky line though of teasing Beelzebub in and making sure you don't get drawn in.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like we're raving or anything. I think, when we dance, we're going to a machination of time, of beat. I wonder if there's something more planned about what Gurdjieff is trying to say.
I think I see where you're coming from with regards to that chapter 2, with it kind of representing the fall. I guess what I'm kind of struggling then is, well, then if it means that the fall's not absolute, because, right, he's allowed to leave and go back to the center of the universe. So does that mean that he's going through and recreating that fall all over again, this time with his grandson?
Did it? So it says that what? It says that Beelzebub's allowed. I thought Beelzebub was banished.
Well, right. What I mean, like, he's banished in that first chapter, right? But I thought that he was allowed to be unbanished in order to go back to the center of the universe, and then that's where they're continuing the journey again, back to the solar system. Or am I misremembering?
Okay, let me.
I think he is pardoned. Yeah, like at some point, it's like the all-knowing did pardon him, and he is permitted to go back to the center of the universe or something. So I think you're right, but yeah, I don't know.
Okay, I'm gonna try find this. Oh yeah, in view of this request of Ashiata Sumash, and also of the modest and cognizant existence of Beelzebub himself, our Maker Creator pardoned him and gave him permission to return to the place of his arising. A certain Ashiata Shimash, and as Beelzebub had then fulfilled a certain need in connection with his mission, she said, the said messenger, when he returned once more to the... Okay, so he sort of finished a mission which allowed him to then return. Okay, so he was like, so this is him going back. To this...
Well, he's on his way to a conference, right? In a different planetary area or something. That he's been invited to, right?
Yeah, with like a load of his kinsmen are going to be there. Conference concerning some events.
But I think we don't know if that's the center of the central universe or something.
Okay.
Maybe that's not. So maybe he's not really returning to the same place on the journey now. I'm not sure.
Okay, but he was allowed back because he completed some sort of mission, which is sort of interesting. Okay. So I mean, in that sense, then it sort of implies like the fall has happened, and it's almost like just an optional the fall is like an optional thing for people, for I guess for beings to realize that they can just overcome that, but it's their own self-interest which keeps them held back.
What, like a ride?
What, you can just get off the ride? Is that what you're trying to like kind of saying?
Oh no, I was just being kind of I mean, I was just like, it seems like it's like, oh, it's like an option. I can like go on the roller coaster or not. I mean, but I still know I'm going to get off at the end of the same spot.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Wow. Cool. Yeah, is there anything else people want to add in?
I thought the spheres were interesting in terms of digestion and how the mind worked and whatnot. I forget what page that was on.
Yeah, that's when he's talking about the beings of the planets, right, and describing the ones that we sort of said were like flies. Yeah. So this for me is page 62. So the upper sphere serving to contain the principal organs of the whole planetary body. So I guess that would be the brain. And the lower sphere, the organs for the transformation of the first and second being foods. So first and second being foods are air and... No, sorry. They are... So first foods are foods as we understand them. Cakes and pasta. And then second is air. And third is impressions. So that lower... the upper sphere, the principal organs, therefore the brain. The lower sphere of the body, the organs which transform foods and air. And then, yeah, he says there are 3 apertures in the upper sphere, one opening outwards to surface sight, the third for hearing, and the lower sphere has 2 apertures, one in the front for taking in the first and second being foods, so I'm guessing that's the mouth. But then that wouldn't equate to being the lower sphere, so this must be a different creature altogether. And then the other at the back for the elimination of from the organism of residues, which we all know what that is. Yeah, so this is a different creature altogether, but like they're so close to being humans, I think we could just use them. It's interesting he uses the word sphere, as you say, and obviously he brings in that idea of like the importance of, we don't even think of foods and things as being digested, we just eat. We don't think of the importance of that, so he brings in those ideas again as well.
Yeah, I was a little confused thinking about the anatomy of this creature, because I was like, how can it take in like food from the lower side? Is he like? I always say I thought of a human. I was like, I don't know about that, but what was he trying to get at if it was a human?
Well, sort of what I took from that is that he does, the body isn't, the way he describes the body is just completely not in equilibrium. He's just describing its parts, which in that sense emphasize the fact they're very disconnected. I guess unless that person seeks to connect them, which is the equilibrium of the body, and processing and digestion is something that Gurdjieff goes on about. But then there's also the point where he says the beings of this planet have very frail planetary bodies, but then on the other hand have a very strong spirit. So there's also that sort of almost obviously we've been reading it, so I'm not an expert, but Neoplatonic idea of like the lessening of one's like egotistical attention to the planetary body in turn can allow for a heightening of the spirit.
What do you suppose he means by 3-brained beings?
3 brains is the emotional, intellectual, and intuitive. So the 3 senses once again. So there is like the animals, dogs and cats, are 2-brained. They're emotional and instinctive. They can't intellectualize things. They're not going to stop and sort of like be like, oh, that's the best. They're just emotionally and emotional and instinctive. And then when you go up in the hierarchy, when you go to So there's a potential. So you can call them like, you could say like man 1, 2, 3. So man 1 is just instinctive. Man 2 is instinctive and emotional, and man 3 is instinctive, emotional, and intelligent. But 1, 2, and 3 use those singularly, right? So if your man 1 is just instinct, if you're man 2, it's like you might use instinct, you might use emotion, but you're still just being pulled around by them. If you're man 3, you might use instinct, emotion, or intelligence, but you're still just using one at a time. You might be combining two or whatever, but you're still being quite singular, like you're just being pulled by your emotions, or you're just doing something intellectually. Man 4, the importance is that the fourth thing is the equilibrium of the previous 3. So man 4 is that first heightened man who uses all 3 together to come to an attentive conclusion. And then there is man's 5, 6, and 7, but they're completely high being. And man 7 is sort of implied that that's like your Jesus. I don't think Gurdjieff ever said what he believed himself to be. I guess he would just know that. But as I understand it in the work, when you go to groups and things, you would sort of, I guess the problem is it's all intuition, but you would be taught by someone who is understood to be on a higher level than you. So yeah, and levels 5 and 6, I think Gurdjieff does make it clear that these are achievable and they're to do with one's higher centers. So you have like a higher center of emotion and a higher center of intelligence, and how you connect to these. And these are possible things. I don't really think he ever says 7 is a possible thing. But I think it's a bit cruel towards dogs, because I've met some pretty intelligent dogs. And then, obviously, jumping back to what we were saying about the hierarchy. So, when you look at this is where it all starts to connect, hopefully, for some people. When you look at the little thing I posted of the ray of creation, so the absolute is 1. I'm trying to remember how. So it's always. Oh God, what is it? Like how they're added up. They can't be just. No, they're just doubled. Anyway, the ray of creation. You'll notice that it's 7 again. There's 7 stages of man, and do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do is the major scale, which Gurdjieff goes on about, and of course between is it re and mi and sol and la, I think, is where the semitones are. So that would be the point where there is difficulty. The semitone is where you need to have a push, right? So in that sense, man 1, sort of a man of the moon, he's just food for the moon. Man 2, etc., etc. You can see how that all sorts of begins to coordinate. So man 7 would not literally of that level, right? So man 7 doesn't literally become the absolute. What it means is when you're, from my understanding, obviously, what it means is when you're on that level of being. So if you're level 4 man who's got the complete equilibrium of the 3 other brains, the intelligence, the emotions, the instinctive, then you are drawing your quote unquote energy, your experience from the level of the sun, some level which is just higher than the planets and the earth and the moon. And by doing that, you overcome those rules that are there. And then onto the side, to the right hand side there, the earth, like the physical body has loads of laws, astral body. So in doing these things, you are preparing, you're building up, you're crystallizing those types of bodies. And it is in that crystallization and in that form of being, in that heightened sense of being and that drawing in of those energies, that you begin to develop a soul, which is the thing which can potentially continue on after death, and go round again, according to Ouspensky. Does that make sense? I hope so.
I think so.
Okay. Yeah, unless anyone has anything else to add, probably a good place to sort of finish up. No? Okay. I will I'll stop recording here.